Hello everyone, welcome back to Easy Education London, and today I wanted to look at the Power and Conflict poems for the English Literature Paper 2. Now the first poem we have is Ozymandias. Now the main themes we have, it's looking at power and conflict. So for Ozymandias, we see a powerful ruler who sees himself as King of Kings, which is a key quote used within the poem. So if we look at King of Kings, you want to look at the significance of that. So if Ozymandias does come up, you want to look at the quote, King of Kings, perhaps a great warrior and one of the most powerful men in the world. The poem is almost being ironic, pointing out that now all that remains is an arrogant boast on a ruined statue. Perhaps the poet feels sorry for him or is laughing at his expense. Either way, it looks about the inevitable downfall of all rulers and tyrants, and how nothing, not even power, lasts forever. So there's a deeper message within Ozymandias that whoever rules, whoever has the pinnacles of power, they ultimately have to let go, because as humans we die and we cannot hold on to power forever. And the use of the plaque is hugely ironic in that the message Ozymandias wanted to leave as his legacy to the world is precisely opposite to the message the world receives. The despair may be more as a result of the realization that power illusory and temporary, rather than despair that nobody could ever hope to compete with Ozymandias' glory. Now, in terms of structure, it's written in a sonnet with loose iambic pentameter, and again, it's in a line making 10 syllables overall. And sonnets were generally popular romantic or love poems, perhaps this being a love poem about Ozymandias, a joke about ruler's ego, or simply to capture the romantic and exotic tone of a legend. The rhyme scheme is irregular, perhaps symbolic of the broken statue itself, no longer perfect. And in terms of context, so remember you do need to mention context as well, it's written by Shelley in a collection in 1819. It was inspired by the recent unearthing of part of a large statue of the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II. The Egyptian pharaohs, like Ramesses, believed themselves to be gods in mortal form, and that their legacy would last forever. The reference to the stone statue is likely a direct reference to the statues and sculptures like the one which was unearthed, which the ancient Egyptians made. On the base of the statue is written, translated, King of Kings am I, Ozymandias. If anyone would know how great I am and where I lie, let him surpass one of my works. So that summarizes Ozymandias, which is one of the 15 poems that may come up in the upcoming exams. Moving on, we have the poem London, as you can see, and the themes we can see in London is looking at power and conflict, which is more about the lack of power and abuse of power. The poem is set in the capital of the most powerful country in the world, and yet words like manacles suggest slavery, whilst the soldier's sigh runs in blood-down palace walls. It's a clear contrast between those with power and those without. Now, in terms of context, William Blake was a poet in Victorian Georgian England. He wrote a selection of poems in his anthologies, Songs of Innocence from Experience. Most of those poems had a counterpart. The experience poems were often more bitter and cynical, whereas the innocence poems were often naive and simple. London is one of few without a counterpart. The poem is set during a time in England where there was poverty, child labour, and a horrific war with France. Women had no rights, death rates from disease and malnutrition were high, and the Industrial Revolution has resulted in many large oppressive factories. Blake's poem often railed against these and how London, arguably the greatest city in the world at that time, was so dirty and corrupt. In terms of structure, it's written in 4 stanzas with a regular alternate scheme. This may reflect the regular walking pace of the narrator as he walks around London. Very important. Don't forget to mention structure in your poems. The last line in each stanza tends to deliver a powerful statement which sums up the rest of the stanza. Stanza 1 focuses on misery. Stanza 2, on people's refusal to stand tall. Stanza 3, the way people are sacrificed for the rich and the powerful. Stanza 4, how all this poverty is corrupting everything good about family life. And revolution and people power. So during this time, France had thrown off and executed their king. The People's Revolution was meant to show that all men are equal and have power. In Britain, a country with an old monarchy and aristocracy, this was scary. Blake is perhaps supporting revolution. So we need to look at the deeper messages and the hidden meanings. What is the poet trying to suggest? Asking people to throw off the manacles of their belief that they should be told what to do. And that is the end of London. The next poem we have is extract from the Prelude, and as you can see, this is one of your 15 poems that may appear in your upcoming exams. So in terms of the themes, the poem is quite hard to relate to conflict and power. However, there is a sense of conflict between man and nature, where nature is eventually shown to be more powerful in the end. So that's the general theme presented in the Prelude. In terms of structure, it's written as much of a much larger piece. This section is 44 lines in blank verse, so there's no real structure. The work is in iambic pentameter to give it a consistent pace. As the poem progresses, the journey the poet is on becomes rougher, and words like "and" are repeated to give it a breathless pace and feel. So that's all to do with structure. And then finally, for context, William Wordsworth was a romantic poet. We don't mean he wrote love poems, but he wrote poems about the world we live in, which challenged people and the way they thought at the time. During this time, epic poems of large length were common, as were the poems which looked at the world and man's place within it. This extract is from a much larger poem. It looks at the spiritual and moral development of a man growing up. So if this appears in your exam, like I said, make sure you read through it and start annotating it for language, structure and form, because these are all crucial things you need to do for the exam. And that concludes extract from the Prelude. Moving on to the next poem. And now we have My Last Duchess, which is one of your 15 poems. Now, the main themes here is that the idea of power and conflict is shown in the way the speaker, the Duke of Ferrara, is showing off his power and also suggesting the control he had over the Duchess's life. There is also conflict between who he presents or wants himself to be and who he really is as a character. So that's the general theme presented in My Last Duchess. In terms of context, Robert Browning was a master of the dramatic monologue, a form using a persona who speaks directly to an imagined listener, thereby dramatizing the speaker's words and allowing us to judge the persona's character. My Last Duchess is based on real figures. The Duchess is thought to be the first wife of the Duke of Ferrara, who died 3 years into their marriage. Browning was a great admirer of the works of Shelley, and this poem displays a similar critique of autocratic rule, in this case the nobility of the Italian Renaissance. And in terms of structure, the poem is an example of dramatic monologue, a speech given by one character. It uses a large number of pauses, also known as caesuras, so we've covered that before, in the poem, along with lines that flow into one another, enjambment, in order to try and capture the tone of the speaker talking away to the messenger and adding in tangents. So these are small opinions and asides. The poem uses rhyming couplets and iambic pentameter. This reflects the style of romantic poets at the time. Despite how this poem is much more sinister and dark, it is another facade for the Duke of Ferrara's character. You will note he is the only character that speaks despite the fact he is talking to someone. He never lets them speak. And that concludes My Last Duchess. Here we have Charge of the Light Brigade, which is the next poem I wanted to look at. Now, the themes in the Charge of the Light Brigade is the following. It's about war, life and death, sacrifice and folly. It naturally links to conflict and is effective at showing people's views on war of the time. The poem also contains a lot of reference to biblical religious ideas as well as bravery and fear. Now, in terms of context, very important, the Crimean War saw British troops fighting in Russia. At this time, while there were basic guns and cannons, people would also fight on horses to rush in and attack before they could reload or stop them. However, the Light Brigade were very lightly equipped, as the name suggests, more for scouting or attacking from the back or sides rather than charging straight in. During a battle, a miscommunication sent the Light Brigade charging head first into the cannons of the other side. It was a huge catastrophe and many died. It showed to the British that even mistakes can happen. It can happen to anyone. Whether you are right at the top or even if you're at the bottom, it's something that can happen. The men were respected for following orders even though they knew they may be wrong. Some, however, have criticized the way they blindly followed orders. Lord Tennyson was the poet who was asked to write about their glorious sacrifice. And there's a reference to the Valley of Death within the poem, which is the Christian prayer, where they have the saying, the Lord's Prayer, which contains the line, "Though I may walk through the valley of death." So this phrase is being used in the poem. It's used to show the scale of importance, and it gives the poem an epic quality. And that summarizes Charge of the Light Brigade. So we've got a blank copy of it. So if you want, you can take a screenshot of this and go over it individually. Here we have Exposure, which is one of our 15 poems. Now, in terms of themes, the poem itself is based on war and so links to conflict. The poem itself is about the weather conditions of living in the trenches rather than any fighting. It is more a poem about the conflict between man and nature. This is extremely relevant because man has created machines that can launch explosive shells for miles and destroy the landscape, and yet nature can still do more harm than any of it. In terms of structure, the poem uses a large amount of ellipses, caesuras, and repetition to create an ongoing sense of waiting and boredom. So remember to comment on this if exposure does appear in your exam. The poem is made of 8 stanzas with a consistent use of a half line to the end. This reinforces the sense of stasis or sameness throughout the poem, that nothing is happening. There is use of pararhyme, showing words that appears to rhyme yet sound wrong when read, to create the sense of unsettledness in the poem the soldiers are falling. Owen also uses a huge amount of onomatopoeia and alliteration in the poem to emphasize the atmosphere and the sound of the weather. And finally, for context, Owen was an English poet whose work was characterized by his anger at the cruelty and waste of war, which he experienced during service on the Western Front. Wilfred Edward Salter Owen was born 18th of March 1893 in Oswestry, Shropshire. He began writing poetry as a teenager. In 1915, he enlisted in the army and was commissioned into the Manchester Regiment. After spending the remainder of the year training in England, he left for the Western Front early in January 1917. After experiencing heavy fighting, he was diagnosed with shell shock. He was evacuated to England and arrived in Craiglockhart War Hospital near Edinburgh in June. He returned to France in August 1918 and in October was awarded the Military Cross for bravery. On 4th of November 1918, he was killed while attempting to lead his men across the Sambre Canal at Oars. The news of his death reached his parents on 11th of November, Armistice Day. And that concludes Exposure. Next up, we have Storm on the Island. So the main themes in Storm on the Island include the poem looks at the conflict between nature and man, and people's fear of the weather. However, the poet also points out that the fears are really rather small in the grand scheme. There's also a hint of war and conflict in the way the weather described The weather is described with bombardment and salvo. In terms of structure, the poem is in blank verse with 19 lines. There are 5 feet, 10 syllables in each line. The verses are unrhymed and it gives a very controversial tone. This is added to by the use of asides. You know what I mean? The poem is in present tense to suggest the storm is occurring at the time. The poem uses a great deal of enjambment to help add to the controversial tone. And an important point for you to mention here is images of terrorist violence can be found throughout the poem, such as blast, exploding, fear, and bombarded, describe the literal term, but also represents the storm of violence happening in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. The first 8 letters of the title spell out the word Stormont, the name of the government buildings in Northern Ireland. The word island also has a phonetic similarity to island. Therefore, the poem works on 2 levels, as a description of the storm and as an extended metaphor for the political situation in Northern Ireland. In terms of context, Seamus Heaney was born in Northern Ireland in 1939, the eldest child in what was to become a family of 9 children. Much of Heaney's poetry is centered on the countryside and farm life that he knew as a boy. He won a scholarship to the Catholic boarding school St. Columb's College, Derry. In the 1960s, he belonged to a group of poets who, he said, used to talk poetry day after day. He has written many collections of poetry, the first of which was published in 1966. He was appointed Professor of Poetry at Oxford University in 1989 and was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1995. The poem is set around a story of a small isolated cottage near the sea in a storm and the exposure to the elements. And that concludes Storm on the Island. Moving on to the next poem, we have Bayonet Charge. In terms of the main themes in Bayonet Charge, the poem is set around conflict in that it is a soldier rushing out of the trenches on the attack. However, the poem also looks at ideas like transformation, humanity, and nature in the form of the yellow hare and the green hedge. In the poem, the soldier is almost more machine or animal than human, and this is reflected in the power-themed words used to describe him. For structure, there are 3 stanzas and the work is largely blank verse, with no set structure. In part, the different lines help to show the pace of the charge, sometimes fast, sometimes stumbling. Towards the end, it picks up speed, perhaps as he approaches his destination or doom. The poet uses a lot of enjambment and caesuras to give a bizarre, erratic speed to the poem. This helps again give a structure to the charge, but also the confusion and intensity of the battle, with explosions and gunfire, as well as the jumbled thoughts of the soldier. For context, the poem is about a nameless soldier going over the top in the trenches. Soldiers would have bayonets attached to the rifles and would use them to stab enemy soldiers. The nameless soldier in the poem seems to become more a weapon than a man, rushing towards the enemy. It is not clear at the end whether he dies, but there is definitely a change in him. His actions are very raw and primal, much like an animal suddenly pausing, preparing to react. The poet Ted Hughes was a former RAF serviceman and includes a great amount of natural and historical ideas in his poems, and he often looks at man's impact on nature. Vocabulary choice. Hughes uses onomatopoeia, alliteration, and assonance and the senses to bring the images to life. Stumbling across is an awkward line to read, evoking the sensation of running across a muddy field. Bullet smacking the belly, so that's a common or popular quote, is a violent image emphasized by sound and alliteration. The assonance of lodged and numb draws attention to the simile and its meaning. And that takes us towards the end of Bayonet Charge. Moving on to the next poem, we have Remains by Simon Armitage. Now, the main themes in Remains is the poem is originally set in a war zone and naturally looks at conflict in a direct way. However, it also looks heavily at the after effects of conflict, very important, and the long-term effects it has on the people involved. Power is partly shown in this as well. Firstly, the soldiers' power over life and death, but later the power over their memory and experiences. Mental health and morality are also key in this. In terms of structure, the poem is written in 8 stanzas, the last of which is a couplet which leaves the poem on a dramatic end note. It does not rhyme and the poem is a monologue, using very controversial asides and syntax to structure the sentences into a very controversial tone. End of story, not really. That's an important quote. There's also a lot of enjambment and caesura used to emphasize the natural speech patterns of the speaker. Another key factor in this poem is the use of colloquialism or slang and personal pronouns to give it a sense of realism. One of my mates. There's a loose set of rhymes in the poem, often internal and used to give an almost childish aspect to the horror of the war zone, suggests how numb this soldier is to what is happening. Now, in terms of context, very important for you to mention context as well in your exam. The poem is written from the perspective of a soldier stationed in Iraq or Afghanistan, or any war zone really. They are on patrol and fire on some bank robbers. One of the looters appeared to possibly have a gun, so they open fire. The rest of the poem is looking at the soldier, even long after this event cannot leave the memory behind and carries this dead man with him in his mind. Post-traumatic stress and mental illness is very common in soldiers who struggle to come to terms with some part of their duty, a horrific memory of killing or being in danger, which gives them nightmares and panic attacks as well as depression and sometimes suicidal tendencies. Simon Armitage is a famous UK poet who is known for being very direct in his work. His recent poems have looked at the experiences of war and soldiers. And that is the end of Remains. So as you can see, we have a blank copy of it, so you can annotate it, take a screenshot and go over the key quotes. Moving on, Poppies is our next poem for the Power and Conflict anthology. So starting off with the themes in Poppies, the poem looks partially at conflict because of the nature of the son going to war. However, it looks at conflict more from the perspective of those it leaves behind and the emotions of the families. It is a behind-the-scenes view of conflict rather than addressing the conflict itself. There is also a level of conflict in the mother's emotions, pride, fear, and sadness. For structure, it's written as a monologue in 4 stanzas and no rhyme scheme. The stanzas are structured along events in the life of a mother and a child. First, the mother looks back at Remembrance Day and the idea of the poppy, which has helped trigger the memory. Secondly, the mother talks about helping her son get ready and seeing him off. Thirdly, the poem explores the emptiness that is left in his absence. Finally, the mother feels drawn to a war memorial, bringing the story back to where it started, yet now with no son around. The suggestion of the dove being that he has died. The poem uses a lot of enjambment and familiar nouns to enhance the idea of natural tone and the mother's voice. Now, for context, the poem looks at a mother of a son who has grown up and gone to war. The poem contains many clues that this is a more modern conflict. However, the poem ends at the memorial, suggesting the son died at war or has at least not yet returned home, and is now missed by the mother who fears the worst. The poem is based very heavily around the idea of poppies as memorials, and therefore the idea of memory. The poem flashes to key moments of the life of the mother and son. The poem also contains a range of emotions. There's a genuine sadness but also pride. The poem does not seem to comment heavily on the war itself. Now finally, imagery. The poem is dense with imagery. Textiles feature strongly with the central metaphor of felt, indicative of the woman's compacted feelings. The tucks, darts, pleats hint at the swooping, gut-wrenching lurch of her emotions and link with the ornamental stitch at the end. It is also, perhaps, an umbilical image connecting mother and son. And that takes us towards the end of Poppies. Next up, we have War Photographer. So as you can see, it's one of your 15 poems for the AQA English Literature Paper 2. So starting off with themes, what are the main themes in this poem? The poem looks at conflict in the sense that he has taken photos of war and fighting. However, there is also conflict between the war zone and rural England. The poet is trying to emphasize how out of touch people are about truth of war, as well as how it is more business or bit of gossip rather than life-changing or destructive. So there's a deeper message within this poem, and how there is corruption within our society. In terms of structure, it's written in 4 stanzas. The poem features rhyming couplets interspaced with non-rhyming lines. The regular structure can represent the order he is giving to the chaos in his photos. Perhaps also the almost mechanical process he's going through and putting that distance between himself and the context. The poem is written as a narrative, leading us through and the act of the photographer processing in his photos. This again helps create a sense of detachment or even cynicism about what this action reflects, that people suffer and lose life, and the end result to us is a few pictures chosen for the newspapers. And in terms of context, the poem is written about a war photographer who has returned home and is developing his photos. The process of developing old-style film photos is rather unusual for many to understand today. Old-style film is very sensitive to light, so it must be done in the dark room lit with red light. The photo itself is developed using chemicals which slowly bring out the photo. It is then hung to dry. All of this can create quite a sinister atmosphere, red light surrounding by hanging photos and chemical smells. The poem is also looking at the contrast between the war zone and safety of being back home, and the way people just do not understand the truth. After all, a single photo cannot show everything. War photographers do a very dangerous job. Many are killed and injured as they must get in harm's way to get the photo they are after. And that is the end of War Photographer, which is again one of the possible poems that may come up in the upcoming exams. Moving on to the next poem. Here we have Tissue, which is one of the challenging poems in your Power and Conflict anthology, often disliked by many of my own students. But again, it's something that you still have to study and be prepared for, because you never know, the exam board might decide to play a few tricks and games and start to experiment and set Tissue as one of the exams. Right. So in terms of themes, the poem looks at conflict in terms of destruction and politics. Particularly, it hints that we make our own conflict by holding on too tight to power and control, and actually the need to relax and remember we are all human. For structure, the poem is written as an ongoing monologue with some internal rhyme through the poem, though with no real pattern to it. It uses enjambment to create a very human and calm tone. The poem starts looking at the joy of simple things like well-used paper, and wonders what the world would be if it had the same qualities. The final part of the poem is both hopeful and a warning, against pride but in favor of growth and acceptance. Imtiaz Darka is a contemporary Scottish poet and filmmaker. She was born in Pakistan and her family moved to Glasgow in 1950s when she was still a baby. Her background and experience of different cultures provide the themes of her poetry. Cultural identity, exile, travel, freedom, and conflict. This is quite a mysterious poem. And like the material we call tissue, the poem seems light and insubstantial. However, there is a conflict with the poem, and perhaps, though we can never be sure, within the poet. The speaker in this poem uses tissue paper as an extended metaphor for life. She considers how paper can alter things and refers to the soft, thin paper of religious books, in particular the Quran. There are also real-life references to other lasting uses we have for paper in our lives, such as maps, receipts, and architect drawings. Each of these items is connected to important aspects of life, journeys, money, and home. These examples demonstrate how important but also how fragile paper is. In the final stages of the poem, the poet links the idea of a building being made from paper to human skin, using the words living tissue, then your skin. This is quite a complex idea and the meaning is open to interpretation. She may be suggesting that the significance of human life will outlast the records we make of it on paper or in buildings. There's also a sense of the fragility of human life and the fact that not everything can last. And that concludes Tissue by Imtiaz Darka. Next up we have the emigree. Starting off with the themes in the emigree, the poem has a deep sense of conflict in terms of emotions and memory. The poet is torn between her childhood memory and her adult understanding. This also reflects in the form of the city itself today, which has become a hostile totalitarian place. So that's like a tongue twister. The concept of a city can be a metaphor for memories and growth in general, progression from childhood to maturity. For structure, the poem follows a three-stanza structure with repetitive elements such as the idea of sunlight. The opening of the poem seems to encompass the speaker, trying to capture the memory. The second stanza builds on the details of this, fleshing out the city in her mind. Finally, the poem seems to veer towards an idea of facing up to the modern dark place her city of memory has become. The poem does not have a particularly consistent structure or any use of rhyme. This perhaps encapsulates the still uncertain understanding of the speaker about her city. This is further enhanced by some of the unusual and unnatural links between ideas and choice of metaphors. The poem uses enjambment to create a flowing pace to the work of a narrative speaker. Finally, although it's at the top, but finally the context for the emigree. The poem explores the memory of the poet and their experiences in a far-off city they spent time in as a child. The poet is looking at this city through the eyes of a child and the happy memories she had. She compares these to the truths she knows as an adult, which is much harder. Emigree relates to the word emigrate, the idea that a person goes and settles in another country, sometimes not feeling welcome to return. The poet bases many of the ideas on modern examples of emigration from countries like Russia or the Middle East, where people are fleeing corruption and tyranny, or those countries change in their absence to some form of dictatorship. And that takes us towards the end of the emigree, which is one of the potential exam questions for your literature paper 2. Moving on to checking out me history. Starting off with the themes. What are the themes presented in Checking Out Me History? Racial identity and history are important to the poem, and the poet writes with a phonetic style to capture their voice and create tone emphasizing his Caribbean origins. Conflict occurs when we see the contrast with what we are taught and what we are not. The nature of the characters and history involved being conflict, and the conflict of the victor whom we remember and those we don't. The poet is also at conflict with them, or with fact and fiction, to emphasize the conflict of his own identity. In terms of context, the poem looks through the voice and experiences of the poet at our understanding of identity through history. We look at our history is taught and the conflict between fact and truths, which is sometimes obscured between race or gender. The poem gives examples of powerful black figures from history, often involved in conflicts themselves in one way or another. Noticeably, the poet emphasizes how we often celebrate our national or cultural history without looking at the history and culture of those who were in conflict with. And finally, structure. Written in irregular rhymes and with short mixed enjambment in verses, the work creates the tone of a man speaking out and angry, frustrated. It also, however, captures the accent and rhythm of the Caribbean ethnicity of the poet. And the parts of the work in italic are almost song-like with a rhythm that seems to suggest stories passed down in song or to a beat. This is done to emphasize that not just the history, but the way it is passed on is very much a part of the poet's identity and draws on his own Caribbean background, at conflict with the repetitive names and dates he was apparently being taught at English schools. And that is the end of checking out my history. Hopefully you have a better understanding of this poem. Moving on to the final poem, and the last and final poem for your Power and Conflict anthology is Kamikaze. Again, it's not in any particular order. So in terms of Kamikaze, the themes, what are the themes presented in Kamikaze? So in Kamikaze, the poem is set in a time and topic of conflict. However, the real conflict is between the rules of society, honor in Japanese culture, and the will to survive and return to a family. The conflict is particularly profound because there appears to be no right answer, and the pilot dies one way or another in the eyes of his family. If not in body, the poem explores the futility of trying to avoid your own destiny. In terms of structure, the poem changes to italic font during the penultimate stanzas and a previous line to indicate the change of speaker. From the narrator-translator to the daughter, it appears as if the daughter is passing on the story to her own children, and the narrator is explaining this process. The final couplet hits home the themes of the poem quite dramatically in a very somber tone, but does not offer an opinion, challenging the reader to come to their own decision. The consistent structure uses quite regular syllable patterns, drifting up and down in length. This gives the poem a ton of nostalgia, but also the rhythm of the waves, which can represent a helplessness, that things will happen. Whatever you do, he will still die in one way or another. The use of asides and calm rural language juxtaposes the setting of war, giving the poem a much more personal scope on a major event. And importantly, context. The poem is set around the events of a kamikaze pilot flying to war and then turning back before it was too late. Kamikaze pilots were expected to use up all their weapons and then suicide by flying into the targets as a final act of destruction. It was considered a great honor in Japan to die for your country. The pilot in this poem returns home and is rejected by his family forever after, his own wife refusing to speak to him. The poem is written both from a narrator and the daughter of the pilot. The narrator explains the events, almost translating the story, while the speaker gives a first-person account of how they excluded her father. The poet questions at the end which death would have been better, to die as a kamikaze pilot young, or to grow old with a family who shut you out. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the video. I believe it is extremely long, but again, it is definitely worthwhile because one of these poems will come up in your upcoming exams. To those of you who watched until the end, thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like and share, as we are going to create more education related content. Thank you for watching Easy Education London. Subscribe, like and share for more.